Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery preparing to check in on my newest worm bin. Regulars on my channel will know already that the newest of my systems are off to the left with the newest stuff off to the right, not counting this bag over here. The bag is the oldest of my systems at this point. So it's out of place, but it's just where it belongs based on convenience, based on its big size. But the newest system is, as you could probably guess already, this one right here that I'm pointing to on the screen. Just as a placeholder, I just put an empty bin next to it, just so I could see where the next system that would follow that would belong and that there's room enough for it. These little guys have been living in this box for 14 days now. And 2 weeks ago when we launched them into the bin, we all took guesses at the number of worms occupying the bin. And so far, 11 people have commented to the video that I posted about that, and those 11 guesses combined with mine account for the estimated worm population in this system. And I'm still expecting, hopefully, a few more contributions to that estimate. And if you haven't seen the video yet, I invite you to check it out now so that your estimate on the worm population can also get factored into the averaging. I'll put a link to that up in the corner of the screen, so you can go check that out and comment to let me know how many worms you believe live in this box. So after 14 days, I'm assuming that they're probably close to done with the banana peel and the figs that they were fed. I threw some food in there before the worms got introduced. And after 2 weeks, I'm guessing that they're probably going to appreciate the meal plan for today: potato, a mango, and some coffee. So why don't we get this system up on the bench and get them fed? Let's get to work. So now the way we began the last check-in with these little guys was in their old system. And within their old system, the way we rounded the worms up was that over a period of time, we enabled the worms to voluntarily collect in one side of the bin by building what I refer to as a horizontal migration feeding zone. So I guess the whole idea behind that is that you're trying to prompt the migration of the worms in such a way that they just do it themselves without, any sort of undue strain. So you're not pushing or pulling or doing anything to cause discomfort or stress. All you're doing is creating a really cozy spot for them. So whatever they had been living in was nudged aside. An edge of the bin was designated as the future collection and haul out spot. And a little different from so many of my other systems was the way that one turned out. Very often I do the haul out of the worms, but then after a subsequent inspection of the material that they'd been occupying, we often find that there's a good many stragglers remaining in the material, and then we attempt to arrange a collection of the stragglers so as to not leave anyone behind. But in this case, we found that the worms had pretty much evacuated the material that they had been occupying. And it did appear to me as if they had all collected in the horizontal migration feeding zone. So after the haul out occurred last time, we didn't attempt to set up a bait box or any sort of method for rounding up the stragglers because it was determined that there were no stragglers. And that particular batch of castings that these little guys left behind in their old home was such that it could go directly into storage, which was kind of nice. So, look at that. This is the, there's going to be leftovers in here, because the worms will have been bought over with the material that was making up their horizontal migration feeding zone. So some of the foods that might have been applied to that horizontal migration feeding zone, as well as all the castings that they created in that horizontal migration feeding zone, were hauled out and just dropped in here. So this entire top layer of material that we're plowing through is pretty much the contents of their horizontal migration feeding zone. And then when you probe down beneath it, you start finding the material with which the system was constructed, all this bedding material. So it is kind of nice to see that down low there are a good many worms cruising around, which to me means that they've kind of accepted the bedding that was used to build their new home, and that it's kind of safe to assume that there's nothing toxic or uncomfortable about it, and that the whole system is fair game for worm traffic at this point. I mean, perhaps some worms are more inclined to remain in the stuff that came over with them, perhaps because it has some lingering remaining nutritional value in it. I mean, for those of you who don't know, worms, after they eat some stuff and then they poop out the worm castings, that process occurs so quickly that the stuff that's coming out at the end has not yet been depleted of nutritional value, not by any sense. So I believe it's estimated that that stuff could be re-eaten, as gross as that might sound, over and over again. I think over a half a dozen times before it's deemed by the worms to have been depleted of its nutritional value. So while the material down low is just a whole bunch of shredded paper, cardboard, maybe some leaves as well, the top layer was their castings from the horizontal migration feeding zone, which just by its nature would be consisting of probably a good bit of nutritional value, since it would have been stuff that all kind of went through that first pass, if you will. So whatever, you get the idea. Let's not linger on that somewhat unpalatable topic. I am kind of going slow here. I'm just attempting to blend in all that stuff that came over with the worms when we drop them in here into the material below, so that everything can sort of equalize and that there's no one section of the bin has any sort of high concentration of this or that. Although there must be little hot spots where the worms definitely prefer being, because here and there I do feel like I'm encountering little worm balls, little pockets of material that do seem to have larger numbers of worms hanging out in it. And in those cases I would just assume that perhaps for whatever reason that material got a little bit more thoroughly soaked, and the worms are probably just drawn to the moisture in that case. So I was kind of busy rambling on there. I didn't really pay too much attention to where we began, but I feel like we've gone almost all the way around the system and had a chance to sort of blend together the materials from up high and from down low. So I think we're almost at the point where we could start thinking about setting up their feeding zone. But guess what? I just bumped into a little object that always manages to slip my mind. But it's the cork. This is the system in which we're working on composting a cork that's probably been floating around in my worm bins for something in the neighborhood of maybe 5 years or so at this point. And it's so weird. It almost looks to me as if it got cut down the middle. So this side of the cork still remains, but the other half of it, this side of it, seems to have just vanished, which is kind of interesting. For the longest time, this cork was just holding out and not showing any signs of deterioration, but it does seem to me like over the past year or so, we've finally started observing some nice progress on that thing. So here's a little bit of leftovers from the last feeding. Banana peel. And here's some more. And I guess we weren't very thorough going through the section of the bin that we would have placed the food into before we introduced the worms, which was down the middle. I kind of went around the perimeter there. So why don't we really quickly just do a quick till up of the middle first before we proceed to feeding. I mean, that's where we're going to feed anyway, so this inspection of the middle portion of the system can simply double as and segue as, or segue into, the feeding because we need to open up a little bit of a trench. That's generally the way I do it, into which we're going to plop today's feeding. And you know, this system definitely has a greater depth than most of the systems that I've been launching worms into recently, and it's a good thing because even though I'm still treating the population count as still sort of coming together with the input we've gotten so far, which, like I said earlier, contributes to an averaging calculation. I simply take my guess combined with all the other guesses, the 11 other guesses so far, and average it. So the I believe it's somewhere between 3,000 and 3,100 worms thought to occupy this system, which was, like I said, all determined based on input from you guys, the viewers, in the comments of the video, showing the launch of this system, the haul out from their old system and the launch into this system here. And you know, it is kind of a good thing that this system has a good bit of depth to it, because my plan was to give them this mango as a whole object. But I do also, after I feed, like the idea of covering up the feeding entirely. So I want to make sure we've created a deep enough hole into which we can place that mango. So the mango, I suppose, can come in as the main course. I can see little tears in the skin, and there's a spot over here where I removed the label that was on it. So I do believe that there are spots on this where the worms should be able to get through the skin and gain access to the food. And then eventually, when they eat all the soft stuff, what's going to remain is that pit, the seed inside the mango. And this is actually a piece of one of those. At one point I decided I would try to help it along, so I came in here with a knife and I put all these little cuts into it, thinking that I can increase the object's surface area and aid in the breakdown. But look at that. If you've ever handled the seed out of a mango, you'll know that it's a super tough object made out of some really hard material. So it's pretty incredible when you get to the point where you can just snap it into little bits and pieces with 2 fingers. And you know what? Let's keep the cork somewhere near the foods that they're getting, so that we can continue to promote a good bit of worm traffic over onto that cork to see if we can continue in aiding its breakdown. And well, let's not forget, we've still got a nice portion of potato to drop in here too. Just based on the weight of this little plastic container with the food in it, it does seem to me like I've given these little guys a feeding which would oftentimes be an amount that I apply to 2 systems. But you know, I've been getting this feeling lately like I'm sort of in overstocked mode as far as stuff in my freezer intended for worm bin feedings. And even though I told myself a couple weeks ago that I want to be really generous with food in my worm bin feedings for a while, I feel like I've not really fulfilled that very well. So hopefully I can get my act together and try to be a little bit more generous with the feedings in my worm bins. So that right there, I believe, is what we intended to do here today. I'm just trying to think if there was anything else that I wanted to do here today. I mean, I did come prepared with a couple of pieces of replacement newspaper that could be used as coverings, because my assumption was that this top covering newspaper that was out here would be so far gone that we would simply scrap it and throw it down in the feeding area. But it did seem to me like it was holding out very well. And my initial idea was to just reuse it and keep it in its current, or maybe at this point its past assignment of top covering. But you know what? I've talked myself into utilizing it as supplemental bedding to complement the feeding that we're giving them. So that's that. And I think that's probably a good idea. And you know, we'll put this feeding zone indicator, well, until it gets applied in that function of feeding zone indicator. It's just a coffee filter right now, but I do use coffee filters to mark where I last fed. And a lot of you might be asking, why? Isn't it pretty obvious just based on the big dip that you find when you return to the bin where the food had been? It is. It's just a little bit of a tradition down here in my worm bins to mark where we last fed using a feeding zone indicator. So my intention was to simply stick to the tradition and deploy that coffee filter in that way. So I'm just excavating a little bit of extra material here so as to end up in the end with a pretty level top surface. There again, aiding me in better judging and seeing, just visually seeing when I come back in here next time, how much of a change has occurred as a result of them consuming what had been placed into the feeding zone. Because like it was when we first got in here, the traffic that we caused down in the middle of the bin by putting that banana peel and the figs down into the middle resulted in a little bit of a dip in the middle. And I assume that next time we come back in here, we're going to see more of the same. We're going to see a big dip showing where the worms have come in to feast on that mango, coffee, and potato peels. So that's pretty much it for our check-in, folks. The last thing we've got to do here is the restoration of our plastic top coverings, which have been doing a really nice job keeping the moisture in the system. I mean, I have my water bottle here ready to squirt if it was deemed necessary to do so, but I didn't feel it was necessary because the system's chock full of moisture, and hopefully the worms agree that it's sufficient to keep them comfortable and healthy. So that's it for the check-in, everyone, with the now 14-day-old Red Wiggler worm bin. Technically getting feeding number 2, since feeding number 1 was already in there to welcome them when they arrived. And like I said, please go visit my last video. The link would have been placed up into the corner of the screen for you. And if you haven't done so already, please contribute an estimate. And then at some point soon, I'll share with all of you what's thought to be the exact worm count estimate, the worm population size in the system. So that's it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.